All right, let's start the recording and start the reading. Oh, no, that's me. Let me quickly switch that tab. Oh, that's not me. Okay. And thank you all for coming. Let's have a quick sip and then get going. Drink water, folks. Okay. Our bodies, ourselves. Let's zoom in a little bit more too. Reproductive rights. When contemporary feminist movement began, the issues that were projected as most relevant were those that were... Sorry, lack of comma there threw me off. Let's start again. Okay, let me just run from the top. We're doing it live, folks. Chapter 5. Our bodies, ourselves. Reproductive rights. When contemporary feminist movement began, the issues that were projected as most relevant were those that were directly linked to the experiences of highly educated white women, most of whom were materially privileged. Since feminist movement followed in the wake of civil rights and sexual liberation, it seemed appropriate at the time that issues around the female body were foregrounded. Contrary to the image the mass media presented to the world, a feminist movement starting with women burning bras at a Miss America pageant and then later images of women seeking abortions. One of the first issues which served as a catalyst for the formation of the movement was sexuality, the issue being the rights of women to choose when and with whom they would be sexual. The sexual exploitation of women's bodies had become a common occurrence in radical movements for social justice, whether socialist, civil rights, etc. When the so-called sexual revolution was at its peak, the issue of free love, which usually meant having as much sex as one wanted with whomever one desired, brought females face to face with the issue of unwanted pregnancy. Before there could be any gender equity around the issue of free love, women needed access to safe, effective contraceptives and abortions. While individual white women with class privilege often had access to both these safeguards, most women did not. Often, individual women with class privilege were too ashamed of unwanted pregnancy to make use of their more direct access to responsible health care. The women of the late 60s and early 70s who clamored for abortions had seen the tragedies of illegal abortions, the misery of forced marriages as a consequence of unwanted pregnancies. Many of us were the unplanned children of talented, creative women whose lives had been changed by unplanned and unwanted pregnancies. We witnessed their bitterness, their rage, their disappointment with their lot in life. And we were clear that there could be no genuine sexual liberation for women and men without better, safer contraceptives, without the rights to a safe, legal abortion. In retrospect, it is evident that highlighting abortion rather than reproductive rights as a whole reflected the class biases of the women who were at the forefront of the movement. While the issue of abortion was and remains relevant to all women, there were other reproductive issues that were just as vital, which needed attention and might have served to galvanize masses. These issues ranged from basic sex education, prenatal care, preventive health care that would help females understand how their bodies worked, to forced sterilization, unnecessary cesareans and or hysterectomies, and the medical complications they left in their wake. Of all these issues, individual white women with class privilege identified most intimately with the pain of unwanted pregnancy, and they highlighted the abortion issue. They were not by any means the only group in need of access to safe legal abortions. As already stated, they were far more likely to have the means to acquire an abortion than poor and working class women. In those days, poor women, black women included, often sought illegal abortions. The right to have an abortion was not a white women only issue. It was simply not the only or even the most important reproductive concern for masses of American women. The development of effective, though not totally safe birth control pills, created by male scientists, most of whom were not anti-sexist, truly paved the way for female sexual liberation, more so than abortion rights. Women like myself, who were in our late teens when the pill was first widely available, were spared the fear and shame of unwanted pregnancies. Responsible birth control liberated many women like myself who were pro-choice, but not necessarily pro-abortion for ourselves from having to personally confront the issue. Excuse me? First belch of the day. While I never had an unwanted pregnancy in the heyday of sexual liberation, many of my peers saw abortion as a better choice than conscious, vigilant use of birth control pills. And they did frequently use abortion as a means of birth control. Using the pill meant a woman was directly confronting her choice to be sexually active. Women who were more conscientious about birth control were often regarded as sexually loose by men. It was easier for some females just to let things happen sexually than take care of the problem later with abortions. We now know that both repeated abortions or prolonged use of birth control pills with high levels of estrogen are not risk-free. Yet women were willing to take risks to have sexual freedom, to have the rights to choose. The abortion issue captured the attention of mass media because it really challenged the fundamentalist thinking of Christianity. It directly challenged the notion that a woman's reason for existence was to bear children. It called the nation's attention to the female body as no other issue could have done. It was a direct challenge to the church. Later, all the other reproductive issues that feminist thinkers called attention to were often ignored by mass media. The long-range medical problems from cesareans and hysterectomies were not juicy subjects for mass media. They actually called attention to a capitalist, patriarchal, male-dominated medical system that controlled women's bodies and did with them anything they wanted to do. To focus on gender injustice in these arenas would have been too radical for a mass media which remains deeply conservative and, for the most part, anti-feminist. No feminist activists in the late 60s and early 70s imagined that we would have to wage a battle for women's reproductive rights in the 90s and the 2020s. Just a note from the reader. Once feminist movement created the Cultural Revolution, which made the use of relatively risk-free contraceptives acceptable and the rights to have a safe legal abortion possible, women simply assumed those rights would no longer be questioned. The demise of an organized, radical feminist, mass-based political movement, coupled with anti-feminist backlash from an organized right-wing political front, which relies on fundamentalist interpretations of religion, placed abortion back on the political agenda. The right of females to choose is now called into question. Sadly, the anti-abortion platform has most viciously targeted state-funded, inexpensive, and, when need be, free abortions. As a consequence, women of all races who have class privilege continue to have access to safe abortions, continue to have the right to choose, while materially disadvantaged women suffer. Masses of poor and working-class women lose access to abortion when there is no government funding available for reproductive rights health care. Women with class privilege do not feel threatened when abortions can be had only if one has lots of money, because they can still have them. But masses of women do not have class power. More women than ever before are entering the ranks of the poor and indigent. Without the right to safe, inexpensive, and free abortions, they lose all control over their bodies. If we return to a world where abortions are only accessible to those females with lots of money, we risk the return of public policy that will aim to make abortion illegal. It's already happening in many conservative states. Women of all classes must continue to make abortions safe, legal, and affordable. So yeah, in the United States... Oh wait, this isn't over. Sorry, I'm so sorry. That looked like a end of chapter gap. Okay. The right of women to choose whether or not to have an abortion is only one aspect of reproductive freedom. I'm doing a terrible job today, by the way. Depending on a woman's age and circumstance of life, the aspect of reproductive rights that matters most will change. A sexually active woman in her 20s or 30s who finds birth control pills unsafe may one day face an unwanted pregnancy, and the right to have a legal, safe, inexpensive abortion may be the reproductive issue that is most relevant. But when she is menopausal and doctors are urging her to have a hysterectomy, that may be the most relevant reproductive rights issue. As we seek to rekindle the flames of mass-based feminist movement, reproductive rights will remain a central feminist agenda. If women do not have the right to choose what happens to our bodies, we risk relinquishing rights in all other areas of our lives. In renewed feminist movement, the overall issue of reproductive rights will take precedence over any single issue. This does not mean that the push for legal, safe, inexpensive abortions will not remain central. It will simply not be the only issue that is centralized. If sex education, preventive health care, and easy access to contraceptives are offered to every female, fewer of us will have unwanted pregnancies. As a consequence, the need for abortions would diminish. Losing ground on the issue of legal, safe, inexpensive abortion means that women lose ground on all reproductive issues. The anti-choice movement is fundamentally anti-feminist. While it is possible for women to individually choose never to have an abortion, allegiance to feminist politics means that they are still pro-choice, that they support the right of females who need abortions to choose whether or not to have them. Young females who have always had access to effective contraception, who have never witnessed the tragedies caused by illegal abortions, have no first-hand experience of the powerlessness and vulnerability to exploitation that will always be the outcome if females do not have reproductive rights. Ongoing discussion about the wide range of issues that come under the heading of reproductive rights is needed if females of all ages and our male allies in struggle are to understand why these rights are important. This understanding is the basis of our commitment to keeping reproductive rights a reality for all females. Feminist focus on reproductive rights is needed to protect and sustain our freedom. All right, that's the end of chapter 5. In the United States, we, of course, have this system where a lot of legislation is divided into the state level and the nationwide level, and there are certain things that are to be applied nationwide, but things like abortion rights often vary from state to state. And so this is something that has to be fought on a local level and something that has to be fought on a national level. And currently it's a battle being waged once again. It is something being tied into this banner of wokeness by the right wing. And yeah, it is something that unfortunately will be a lifelong issue. And as long as we are approaching things from the perspective like it's a finish line, we can simply cross and be done with it forever in terms of any issue we fight for, we're not going to get where we need to go. It's always a process. All right, folks, chapter 6, Beauty Within and Without. Challenging sexist thinking about the female body was one of the most powerful interventions made by contemporary feminist movement. Before women's liberation, all females, young and old, were socialized by sexist thinking to believe that our value rested solely on appearance and whether or not we were perceived to be good-looking, especially by men. Understanding that females could never be liberated if we did not develop healthy self-esteem and self-love, feminist thinkers went directly to the heart of the matter, critically examining how we feel and think about our bodies and offering constructive strategies for change. Looking back after years of feeling comfortable choosing whether or not to wear a bra, I can remember what a momentous decision this was 30 years ago. Women stripping their bodies of unhealthy and uncomfortable restrictive clothing, bras, girdles, corsets, garter belts, etc., was a ritualistic, radical reclaiming of the health and glory of the female body. Females today who have never known such restrictions can only trust us when we say that this reclaiming was momentous. On a deeper level, this ritual validated women wearing comfortable clothing on all levels in our lives. Just to be able to wear pants to work was awesome to many women, whose jobs had required them to be constantly bending and stooping over. For women who had never been comfortable in dresses and skirts, all these changes were exciting. Today, they can appear trivial to females who have been able to freely choose what they want to wear from childhood on. Many adult women embracing feminism stopped wearing crippling, uncomfortable high-heeled shoes. These changes led the shoemaking industry to design comfortable low shoes for women. No longer forced by sexist tradition to wear makeup, women looked in the mirror and learned to face ourselves just the way we are. The clothing and revolution created by feminist interventions let females know that our flesh was worthy of love and adoration in its natural state. Nothing had to be added unless a woman chose further adornment. Initially, capitalist investors in the cosmetic and fashion industry feared that feminism would destroy their business. They put their money behind mass media campaigns, which trivialized women's liberation by portraying images which suggested feminists were big, hyper-masculine, and just plain old ugly. In reality, women involved in feminist movement came in all shapes and sizes. We were utterly diverse. And how thrilling to be free to appreciate our differences without judgment or competition. There was a period in the early days of feminism when many activists abdicated all interest in fashion and appearance. These individuals often harshly critiqued any woman who showed an interest in frilly feminine attire or makeup. Most of us were excited to have options. And given choice, we usually decided in the direction of comfort and ease. It has never been a simple matter for women to unite a love of beauty and style with comfort and ease. Women had to demand that the fashion industry, which was totally male-dominated in those days, create diverse styles of clothing. Magazines changed. Feminist activists called for more women writers and articles on serious subjects. For the first time in our nation's history, women were compelled to acknowledge the strength of our consumer dollars, using that power to create positive change. Challenging the industry of sexist-defined fashion opened up the space for females to examine for the first time in our lives the pathological, life-threatening aspects of appearance obsession. Compulsive eating and compulsive starvation were highlighted. While they created different looks, these life-threatening addictions had the same root. Feminist movement compelled the sexist medical establishment to pay attention to these issues. Initially, this establishment ignored feminist critique. But when feminists began to create health centers, providing a space for female-centered, positive healthcare, the medical industry realized that, as with fashion, masses of women would take their consumer dollars and move in the direction of those healthcare facilities which provided the greater care, ease, and respect for women's bodies. All the positive changes in the medical establishment's attitudes towards the female body, towards female healthcare, are the direct outcome of feminist struggle. When it comes to the issue of medical care, of taking our bodies seriously, women continue to challenge and confront the medical industry. This is one of the few places where feminist struggle garners mass support from women, whether they are or are not committed to feminist politics. We see the collective power of women when it comes to gynecological matters, to those forms of cancer, especially breast cancer, that threaten females more than males, and more recently in the area of heart disease. Feminist struggle to end eating disorders has been an ongoing battle because our nation's obsession with judging females of all ages on the basis of how we look was never completely eliminated. It continues to grip our cultural imagination. By the early 80s, many women were moving away from feminism. While all females reaped the benefits of feminist interventions, more and more females were embracing anew sexist-defined notions of beauty. Individual women who had been in their early 20s when contemporary feminist movement began were moving into their late 40s and 50s. Even though feminist changes in the way we see male bodies have made aging a more positive experience for women, facing the reality of aging in patriarchal society, particularly the reality of no longer being able biologically to bear children, led many women to adopt anew the old sexist notions of feminine beauty. Nowadays, more than ever before in our nation's history, a huge number of heterosexual women past 40 were and are still single. Finding themselves in competition with younger women, many of whom are not and will never be feminist, for male attention. They often emulate sexist representations of female beauty. Certainly, it was in the interest of a white supremacist, capitalist, patriarchal fashion and cosmetic industry to re-glamorize sexist-defined notions of beauty. Mass media has followed suit. In movies, on television, and in public advertisements, images of reed-thin, dyed blonde women looking as though they would kill for a good meal have become the norm. Back with a vengeance, sexist images of female beauty abound and threaten to undo much of the progress gained by feminist interventions. Tragically, even though females are more aware than ever before of the widespread problem of life-threatening eating disorders in our nation's history, a large group of females from the very young to the very old are still starving themselves to be thin. The disease of anorexia has become a commonplace theme, a subject in books, movies, etc. But no dire warnings work to deter females who believe their worth, beauty, and intrinsic value will be determined by whether or not they are thin. Today's fashion magazines may carry an article about the dangers of anorexia while bombarding its readers with images of emaciated young bodies representing the height of beauty and desirability. The confusing message is most damaging to those females who have never claimed a feminist politics. Yet there are recent feminist interventions aimed at renewing our efforts to affirm the natural beauty of female bodies. Girls today are often just as self-hating when it comes to their bodies as their pre-feminist counterparts were. While feminist movement produced many types of pro-female magazines, no feminist-oriented fashion magazine appeared to offer all females alternative visions of beauty. To critique sexist images without offering alternatives is an incomplete intervention. Critique in and of itself does not lead to change. Indeed, much feminist critique of beauty has merely left females confused about what a healthy choice is. As a middle-aged woman gaining more weight than ever before in my life, I want to work at shedding pounds without deploying sexist body self-hatred to do so. Nowadays, in a fashion world, especially on the consumer side, where clothing that looks like it has been designed simply for reed-thin adolescent girl bodies is the norm, all females, no matter their age, are being socialized either consciously or unconsciously to have anxiety about their body, to see flesh as problematic. While we are fortunate that some stores carry beautiful clothing for women of all sizes and shapes, often this clothing is far more pricey than the cheaper clothing the fashion industry markets towards the general public. Increasingly, today's fashion magazines look like the magazines of the past. More and more bylines are by males. Seldom do articles have a feminist perspective or feminist content, and the fashions portrayed tend to reflect sexist sensibility. These changes have been unacknowledged publicly because so many of the feminist women who have come to mature adulthood exercise their freedom of choice and seek healthy alternative models of beauty. However, if we abandon the struggle to eliminate sexist-defined notions of beauty altogether, we risk undermining all the marvelous feminist interventions which allowed us to embrace our bodies and ourselves and love them. Although all females are more aware of the pitfalls and dangers of embracing sexist notions of female beauty, we are not doing enough to eliminate those dangers, to create alternatives. Young girls and adolescents will not know that feminist thinkers acknowledge both the value of beauty and adornment if we continue to allow patriarchal sensibilities to inform the beauty industry in all spheres. Rigid feminist dismissal of female longings for beauty has undermined feminist politics. While this sensibility is more uncommon, it is often presented by mass media as the way feminists think. Until feminists go back to the beauty industry, go back to fashion, and create an ongoing, sustained revolution, we will not be free. We will not know how to love our bodies as ourselves. So that's a really key chapter, an interesting chapter. I think it can be a bit controversial in certain senses. I think that there's a sense that, for one, there's a bit of a sort of ignoring in the chapter, or not ignoring, but not necessarily a tackling in the chapter of the ways capitalism plays into building, developing, and capitalizing off of certain sentiments by women and by people about what beauty is, and even just the notions of body diversity that we often get today presented by corporate entities seeking to capitalize off of different bodies and off of progressive ideas of beauty. This is something that sort of has changed a bit since the time that this book was written, and it's still, it still remains quite relevant. And I think sometimes when Hooks uses the language of the power of our dollars and our consumer power to make demands of the market, it ultimately plays into a certain sense of the market being a bit equitable, or a bit more equitable than perhaps it actually is, especially in terms of like working as intended, meeting demand, etc. Whereas the market creates sort of demand by itself. Producers create demand by producing, and sort of astroturfing demand and all these different things that they do. But this is not to say that Hooks has no point in saying, for one, that women on the production and consumption level have to, not just women, but all of us have a task on the production and the consumption level to challenge industries like the fashion industry, the beauty industries, with all the different tools at our disposal, to push something different into the direction of something more liberatory, or at least to the direction of something that is more available, useful, affordable for large masses of people. This is also, and something you might note from this book, it's also sort of predating a lot more of the conversations we have now about what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a man, what non-binary gender identity means, and what transgender gender identity consists of. And so certain references to the natural female body and all of that, if not intentionally or overtly or directly even, can feel a bit exclusionary towards trans women. I think that would potentially be a valid critique, but it's also something that I don't think is necessarily overt in the text, or something that can't be read into the text, can't be adapted into the text by somebody who's skillfully reading it in today's landscape, let's say. And finally, I just want to make a note about sort of points people make about Gen Z, and the way Gen Z has sort of apparently adapted and rehashed gender essentialism and beauty essentialism in today's day and age, even in a time where Gen Z is perceived to be this progressive generation. And we see that a lot with like these TikTok trends about, I don't know, what is it now, like it's silicone face, buccal fat removal and shit like that, right? There's just constant reiterations of things like girl dinners and things like different trends of ways, why your body is shaped this way, your body is shaped more like this, and your arms look more like this, and it's a quite exhausting sort of new age reiteration of a lot of these themes. But I also think that it just speaks to the overall endurance of the desire to be accepted and to fit and to succeed within the society established, even though that society is unjust, which pushes people more and more towards trying to build commonalities, solidarities, and successes in collective senses and individualistic senses through those norms. And so in a lot of ways, these things are especially relevant today, that Bell Hooks writes about when it comes to eating disorders. Disordered eating, conversations about anorexia are not as mainstream anymore. One might get the sense that we tackled that, we figured it out. But of course, disordered eating is still very much a thing in terms of, a lot of the mainstream discourse about, calories in and calories out, and the mainstream discourse about intermediary fasting, or whatever it's called. These things, with regard to like certain types of fasting, it's not necessarily something that's unhealthy or based on unhealthy beauty standards, but a lot of them deeply simplify, essentialize, to an unhelpful degree, the nature of the human body, which is often, reliant on a lot of different factors. Certain people are not going to lose weight the same way. Calories in and out is not at all a very effective way of judging how you're going to lose weight or not. There's so many different body functions that need to be fulfilled if you're not getting the right nutrition, etc., etc. And that's part of the problem with emphasizing weight loss as a part of healthifying oneself. Not even that weight loss is something that isn't healthy. Sometimes, in some cases, sure, it can be healthy. And that's a very sticky subject in and of itself. But especially our mainstream conceptions of what it takes to lose weight and what a healthy weight loss process looks like and consists of are so out of touch and with the actual science of the body that we understand, and often are just very destructive for us. And so, yeah. We have some comments I'll read. Many people think feminism means centering women in a hierarchy where women are at the top, but that remains patriarchal. A matriarchy will look out for everyone, particularly children and men. That's infinite text. Sophie says, I would assume the natural feminine body is more about hormones, and as such, at least as a trans woman, that's how I try to take it. That makes sense as well, Sophie. It would be nice to have better language around hormones and gender, maybe. I don't know. Quite possible. But yeah, there's a lot in that chapter that's really fascinating and can still be applied very strongly to today's discourse, even if there's some things that you might feel a need to adjust or clean up. In my opinion, especially with a look at the lens of, more radical visions of gender identity, etc., etc., and notions of capitalism. Chapter 7. Feminist class struggle. Speaking of capitalism. Class difference and the way in which it divides women was an issue women in feminist movement talked about long before race. In the mostly white circles of a newly formed women's liberation movement, the most glaring separation between women was that of class. White working class women recognized that class hierarchies were present in the movement. Conflict arose between the reformist vision of women's liberation, which basically demanded equal rights for women within the existing class structure, and more radical and or revolutionary models, which called for fundamental change in the existing structure so that models of mutuality and equality could replace the old paradigms. However, as feminist movement progressed and privileged groups of well-educated white women began to achieve equal access to class power with their male counterparts, feminist class struggle was no longer deemed important. From the onset of the movement, women from privileged classes were able to make their concerns the issues that should be focused on, in part because they were the group of women who received public attention. They attracted mass media. The issues that were most relevant to working women or masses of women were never highlighted by mainstream mass media. Betty Friedan's The Feminist Mystique identified that the problem that has no name as the dissatisfaction females felt about being confined and subordinated in the home as housewives. While this issue was presented as a crisis for women, it really was only a crisis for a small group of well-educated white women. While they were complaining about the dangers of confinement in the home, a huge majority of women in the nation were in the workforce. And many of these working women, who put in long hours for low wages while still doing all the work in the domestic household, would have seen the right to stay home as freedom. It was not gender discrimination or sexist oppression that kept privileged women of all races from working outside the home. It was the fact that the jobs that would have been available to them would have been the same low-paying, unskilled labor open to all working women. Elite groups of highly educated females stayed at home rather than do the type of work large numbers of lower middle class and working class women were doing. Occasionally, a few of these women defied convention and worked outside the home, performing tasks way below their educational skills and facing resistance from husbands and family. It was this resistance that turned the issue of their working outside the home into an issue of gender discrimination and made opposing patriarchy and seeking equal rights with men of their class the political platform that chose feminism rather than class struggle. From the outset, reformist white women with class privilege were well aware that the power and freedom they wanted was the freedom they perceived men of their class enjoying. Their resistance to patriarchal male domination in the domestic household provided them with a connection they could use to unite across class with other women who were weary of male domination. But only privileged women had the luxury to imagine working outside the home would actually provide them with an income, which would enable them to be economically self-sufficient. Working class women already knew that the wages they received would not liberate them. Reformist efforts on the part of privileged groups of women to change the workforce so that women workers would be paid more and face less gender-based discrimination and harassment on the job had positive impact on the lives of all women. And these gains are important. Yet the fact that the privileged gained in class power while masses of women still do not receive wage equity with men is an indication of the way in which class interests superseded feminist efforts to change the workforce so that women would receive equal pay for equal work. Lesbian feminist thinkers were among the first activists to raise the issue of class in feminist movement, expressing their viewpoints in an accessible language. They were a group of women who had not imagined they could depend on husbands to support them. And they were often much more aware than their straight counterparts of all the difficulties all women would face in the workforce. In the early 70s, anthologies like Class and Feminism, edited by Charlotte Bunch and Nancy Myron, published work written by women from diverse class backgrounds who were confronting the issue in feminist circles. Each essay emphasized the fact that class was not simply a question of money. In The Last Straw, Rita Mae Brown, who was not a famous writer at the time, clearly stated, "Class is much more than Marx's definition of relationship to the means of production. Class involved your behavior, your basic assumptions, how you are taught to behave, what you expect from yourself and from others, your concept of a future, how you understand problems and solve them, how you think, feel, act." These women who entered feminist groups made up of diverse classes were among the first to see that the vision of a politically based sisterhood where all females would unite together to fight patriarchy could not emerge until the issue of class was confronted. Placing class on feminist agendas opened up the space where the intersections of class and race were made apparent. Within the institutionalized race, sex, class, social system in our society, black females were clearly at the bottom of the economic totem pole. Initially, well-educated white women from working class backgrounds were more visible than black females of all classes in feminist movement. They were a minority within the movement, but theirs was the voice of experience. They knew better than their privileged class comrades of any race the costs of resisting race, class, and gender domination. They knew what it was like to struggle to change one's economic situation. Between them and their privileged class comrades, there were ongoing conflicts over appropriate behavior, over the issues that would be presented as fundamental feminist concerns. Within feminist movement, women from privileged class backgrounds who had never before been involved in leftist freedom fighting, learned the concrete politics of class struggle, confronting challenges made by less privileged women, and also learning in the process assertiveness skills and constructive ways to cope with conflict. Despite constructive intervention, many privileged white women continued to act as though feminism belonged to them, as though they were in charge. Mainstream patriarchy reinforced the idea that the concerns of women from privileged class groups were the only ones worthy of receiving attention. Feminist reform aimed to gain social equality for women within the existing structure. Privileged women wanted equality with men of their class. Despite sexism among their class, they would not have wanted to have the lot of working class men. Feminist efforts to grant women social equality with men of their class neatly coincided with white supremacist capitalist patriarchal fears that white power would diminish if non-white people gained equal access to economic power and privilege. Supporting what in effect became white power reformist feminism enabled the mainstream white supremacist patriarchy to bolster its power while simultaneously undermining the radical politics of feminism. Only revolutionary feminist thinkers expressed outrage at this co-optation of feminist movement. Our critique and outrage gained a hearing the alternative press. In her collection of essays, The Coming of Black Genocide, radical white activist Mary Barfoot boldly stated, "There are white women, hurt and angry, who believed that the 70s women's movement meant sisterhood, and who feel betrayed by escalator women, by women who went back home to the patriarchy. But the women's movement never left the Father Dick's side. There was no war, and there was no liberation. We got a share of genocide profits, and we love it. We are sisters of patriarchy and true supporters of national and class oppression. Patriarchy in its highest form is Euro-imperialism on a world scale. If we're Dick's sister and want what he has gotten, then in the end we support that system that he got it all from." Indeed, many more feminist women found and find it easier to consider divesting of white supremacist thinking than of their class elitism. As privileged women gained greater access to economic power with men of their class, feminist discussions of class were no longer commonplace. Instead, all women were encouraged to see the economic gains of affluent females as a positive sign for all women. In actuality, these gains rarely changed the lot of poor and working class women. And since privileged men did not become equal caretakers in the domestic household, the freedom of privileged class women of all races has required the sustained subordination of working class and poor women. In the 90s, collusion with the existing social structure was the price of women's liberation. At the end of the day, class power proved to be more important than feminism, and this collusion helped destabilize feminist movement. When women acquired greater class status and power without conducting themselves differently from males, feminist politics were undermined. Lots of women felt betrayed. Middle and lower middle class women who were suddenly compelled by the ethos of feminism to enter the workforce did not feel liberated once they faced the hard truth that working outside the home did not mean work in the home would be equally shared with male partners. No-fault divorce proved to be more economically beneficial to men than women. As many black women/women of color saw white women from privileged classes benefiting economically more than other groups from reformist feminist gains, from gender being tacked on to racial affirmative action, it simply reaffirmed their fear that feminism was really about increasing white power. The most profound betrayal of feminist issues has been the lack of mass-based feminist protest, challenging the government's assault on single mothers and the dismantling of the welfare system. Privileged women, many of whom call themselves feminists, have simply turned away from the feminization of poverty. The voices of power feminism tend to be highlighted in mass media far more than the voices of individual feminist women who have gained class power without betraying our solidarity towards those groups without class privilege. Being true to feminist politics, our goals were and are to become economically self-sufficient and to find ways to assist other women in their efforts to better themselves economically. Our experiences counter the assumption that women can only gain economically by acting in collusion with the existing capitalist patriarchy. All over this nation, individual feminists with class power who support a revolutionary vision of social change share resources and use our power to aid reforms that will improve the lives of women irrespective of class. The only genuine hope of feminist liberation lies with a vision of social change which challenges class elitism. Western women have gained class power and greater gender inequality because a global white supremacist patriarchy enslaves and/or subordinates masses of third world women. In this country, the combined forces of a booming prison industry and workfare-oriented welfare, in conjunction with conservative immigration policy, create and condone the conditions for indentured slavery. Ending welfare will create a new underclass of women and children to be abused and exploited by the existing structures of domination. Given the changing realities of class in our nation, widening gaps between the rich and poor, and the continued feminization of poverty, We desperately need a mass-based radical feminist movement that can build on the strength of the past, including the positive gains generated by reforms, while offering meaningful interrogation of existing feminist theory that was simply wrong-minded, while offering us new strategies. Significantly, a visionary movement would ground its work in the concrete conditions of working class and poor women. That means creating a movement that begins with education for critical consciousness, where women, feminist women with class power, need to put in place low-income housing women can own. The creation of housing co-ops with feminist principles would show us the ways feminist struggle is relevant to all women's lives. When women with class power opportunistically use a feminist platform, while undermining feminist politics that help keep in place a patriarchal system that will ultimately resubordinate them, they do not just betray feminism, they betray themselves. Returning to a discussion of class, feminist women and men will restore the conditions needed for solidarity. We will then be better able to envision a world where resources are shared and opportunities for personal growth abound for everyone irrespective of their class. Okay, so that's an interesting take on class and feminism that Bell Hooks offers here. I do like Sophie's comment that Bell Hooks always does her best unapologetically. It doesn't feel like she's trying to sanitize her points, even if she might neglect a trans perspective sometimes, for example. And I will just say that, like, I think a reading of Marx that ultimately sees him as just saying class is just a relationship to the means of production, I think does a disservice to a strong Marxist reading, which ultimately acknowledges just as strongly as he does at the end of Capital Volume 1. I always quote this, or I always cite this, that all of these things are mediated. Class is a mediated category just as race is, just as gender is. They're mediated by a society that is oriented by and produced by and dominated by the needs and desires of the capitalist class, the ruling class. And so class is sometimes considered by many sort of reductive Marxists as something that just happens, that just is there, that's objective. You know, you can just objectively see class, even though class is mediated. You can objectively see class. It's something that's obvious. It's something that's actual scientific, in the sense that it's, you know, undoubtable, and that's different from identity categories. But that's not true. Identity and class-based struggle are both in tandem. They're both part of the mediation that is required and generated in a society based on domination. And that's something that doesn't benefit anybody, right? That's just basically what I have to say for now on that. Whew, voice is starting to get tired. I'm going to actually end early. I'll just end on chapter 8 here. This will be the last chapter that I read because my voice is starting to give out a little bit. Chapter 8, Global Feminism. Individual female freedom fighters all over the world have single-handedly struggled against patriarchy and male domination. Since the first people on the planet Earth were non-white, it is unlikely that white women were the first females to rebel against male domination. In white supremacist, capitalist, patriarchal Western culture, neo-colonial thinking sets the tone for many cultural practices. That thinking always focuses on who has conquered a territory, who has ownership, who has the rights to rule. Contemporary feminist politics did not come into being as a radical response to neo-colonialism. Privileged class white women swiftly declared their ownership of the movement, placing working class white women, poor white women, and all women of color in the position of followers. It did not matter how many working class white women or individual black women spearheaded the women's movement in radical directions. At the end of the day, white women with class power declared that they owned the movement, that they were the leaders and the rest of merely followers. Parasitic class relations have overshadowed issues of race, nation, and gender in contemporary neocolonialism, and feminism did not remain aloof from that dynamic. Initially, when feminist leaders in the United States proclaimed the need for gender equality here, they did not seek to find out if corresponding movements were taking place among women around the world. Excuse me. Instead, they declared themselves liberated and, therefore, in the position to liberate their less fortunate sisters, especially those in the Third World. This neocolonial paternalism had already been enacted to keep women of color in the background, so that only conservative/liberal white women would be the authentic representatives of feminism. Radical white women tend not to be represented, and if represented at all, they are depicted as a fringe, freak element. No wonder, then, that the power feminism of the 90s offers wealthy, white, heterosexual women as the examples of feminist success. All this is very much, by the way, as a tangent, reminding me of music industry discourses about people like Katy Perry and Taylor Swift. Anyway. In truth, their hegemonic takeover of feminist rhetoric about equality has helped mask their allegiance to the ruling classes within white supremacist capitalist patriarchy. Radical feminists were dismayed to witness so many women of all races appropriating feminist jargon while sustaining their commitment to Western imperialism and transnational capitalism. While feminists in the United States were right to call attention to the need for global equality for women, problems arose as those individual feminists with class power projected imperialist fantasies onto women globally, the major fantasy being that women in the United States have more rights than any group of women globally, are free if they want to be, and therefore have the rights to lead feminist movement and set feminist agendas for all the other women in the world, particularly women in third world countries. Such thinking merely mirrors the imperialist racism and sexism of ruling groups of Western men. Most women in the United States do not even know or use the terms colonialism and neocolonialism. Most American women, particularly white women, have not decolonized their thinking either in relation to the racism, sexism, and class elitism they hold towards less powerful groups of women in this society, or the masses of women globally. When unenlightened individual feminist thinkers addressed global issues of gender exploitation and oppression, they did and do so from a perspective of neocolonialism. Significantly, radical white women writing in Night Vision, Illuminating War and Class on the Neocolonial Terrain, emphasize the reality that to not understand neocolonialism is to not live fully in the present. Since unenlightened white feminists were unwilling to acknowledge the spheres of American life where they acted and act in collusion with imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy, sustained protest and resistance on the part of black women/women of color and our radical white sisters was needed to break the wall of denial. Yet even when large numbers of feminist activists adopted a perspective which included race, gender, class, and nationality, the white power feminists continued to project an image of feminism that linked and links women's equality with imperialism. Global women's issues like forced female circumcision, sex clubs in Thailand, the veiling of women in Africa, India, the Middle East, and Europe, the killing of female children in China, remain important concerns. However, feminist women in the West are still struggling to decolonize feminist thinking and practice so that these issues can be addressed in a manner that does not reinscribe Western imperialism. Consider the way many Western women, white and black, have confronted the issue of female circumcision in Africa and the Middle East. Usually these countries are depicted as barbaric and uncivilized. The sexism there portrayed as more brutal and dangerous to women than the sexism here in the United States. A decolonized feminist perspective would first and foremost examine how sexist practices in relation to women's bodies globally are linked. For example, linking circumcision with life-threatening eating disorders, which are the direct consequence of a culture imposing thinness as a beauty ideal. Or any life-threatening cosmetic surgery, would emphasize that the sexism, the misogyny underlying these practices globally mirror the sexism here in this country. When issues are addressed in this manner, Western imperialism is not reinscribed, and feminism cannot be appropriated by transnational capitalism as yet another luxury product from the West women in other cultures must fight to have the right to consume. Until radical women in the United States challenge those groups of women posing as feminists in the interest of class opportunism, the tone of global feminism in the West will continue to be set by those with the greatest class power who hold old biases. Radical feminist work around the world daily strengthens political solidarity between women beyond the boundaries of race/ethnicity and nationality. Mainstream mass media rarely calls attention to these positive interventions. In Hatreds, Racialized and Sexualized Conflicts in the 21st Century, Zilla Eisenstein shares the insight. Feminisms as transnational, imagined as the rejection of false race/gender borders and falsely constructed other, is a major challenge to masculinist nationalism, the distortions of statist communism and free market globalism. It is a feminism that recognizes individual diversity and freedom and equality, defined through and beyond North/West and South/East dialogues. No one who has studied the growth of global feminism can deny the important work women are doing to ensure our freedom. No one can deny that Western women, particularly women in the United States, have contributed much that is needed to this struggle and need to contribute more. The goal of global feminism is to reach out and join global struggles to end sexism, sexist exploitation, and oppression. All right. So that was chapter 8. I think a lot of that really sticks out to me as something that feels in tandem, or it feels like it sings with regards to the stuff I cover in geopolitics and stuff like that. And I think if you don't try to take a approach to understanding geopolitics and understanding domination and capitalism and oppression and the IMF and World Bank and systems of imperialism, you'll have a really hard time understanding anything in terms of capitalism, white supremacy, or sexism. All of those things are so deeply interlinked with imperialism, as is homophobia, transphobia, etc. So that you can't really understand those things without understanding imperialism. And, we've all come across people who probably need to do that reading. With that, that's the end of the stream for today. Next time I will come in to read, hopefully from chapter 9 to, let's say, 13. That'll be the goal. Chapter 9 to 13, that'll be like a 30-page reading. That would probably be next week or maybe this weekend. We'll see. I'll let you guys know on the community posts. So thank you so much for joining me, and have a wonderful, wonderful day. Oh, that's the wrong screen. Oh, there we go.